Okay, today, sorry, I'm hearing, oh wait, excuse me. I must be picking up myself on Facebook Live. I don't usually watch myself because I think my voice sounds weird. So, and you're supposed to say, no, it doesn't. It sounds, thanks a lot. Um, so today, the days before the day after, um, that title could be subject to different interpretations. And did you lose me? Okay. Okay. Oh, so they're enhancing the sound back there. Um, you could interpret this a number of ways. There's been a lot of discussion about a certain sign that's supposed to occur on September 23rd and what that means. And is somebody yelling at me? Okay. And sorry about that. We're having some technical issues, I think. So there's supposed to be a sign on September 23rd, and what that means, what is going to take place, what it means, and a lot of people have written to me and said, why don't you talk about it? And the reason is that I have personally found the conduct regarding this particular event and its interpretation to be extremely divisive, and the discussion about it to be very unchristlike. For 20 years, those of you who know me and attended the class I used to teach somewhere else know that I have talked about what's happening in the world, how it lines up with Bible prophecy, if not every week, almost every week for 20 years. That will not change. It has not changed, and I will continue to do that as long as I have a platform and a brain that allows me to read things and analyze them and communicate them. But I have been very distressed about the conduct of a lot of people on both sides regarding the September 23rd sign. I said about a month ago, whether it happens or not, whether it turns out to be significant or not, is not going to change what I've talked about for 20 years. I have been very concerned, though, about people who have been, I think, thoughtfully critical of some of the analysis, have been accused of being all about the money and only wanting to sell their books when a number of them don't sell books. I participate in a lot of Facebook discussions, and I don't know how else to say this. For crying out loud, people, chill out. God, the Lord is returning. We know this. There's disagreement about the timing. And trust me, I don't mind if there's argument and disagreement. If I can say it again, for crying out loud, I'm a lawyer. My whole life is an argument. Seriously. Not when I get home. okay? But it's the nature of the legal system, is you argue your case. I will note, for the record, that as we've gotten deeper into the end times, closer to the return of the Lord, there is a flight from reason. And it exists in many, many places. It exists in our government. It exists in the churches. It exists in our legal system. And I increasingly see what I consider to be more craziness in the arguments that people make in cases that I'm involved in. And I'll admit sometimes my client doesn't have the best case, but you have no idea I just see people, they're losing it everywhere. We'll see some examples of that today. I'm concerned when Christians lose it and lose the ability to reason and start calling other people's names, okay? I don't mind an argument. I don't mind well-reasoned arguments. But there is too much of what I will, and Pastor Steve, you can just, put up the big stop sign if I'm going too far. But there is too much what I would call prophetic triumphalism, that I have figured it out and I'm better than everybody else, and the rest of you are deceived or stupid. And I have considered withdrawing from Facebook just because of the constant haranguing of other people by people who claim to be followers of Christ. And look, I know that I'm subject to the same criticism as well, because I'm not perfect. But at a time when I think it's a tool of the enemy, and at a time when I think the church should be more unified than ever, the true remnant church, we're fighting about interpretations of future events. We're not going to know for sure. We can sit there and we can look through the scriptures and we can reason and figure out, okay, this seems to be the most likely scenario, or a scenario. This is how this may play out. But until it actually happens, we don't know for certain. So at some point, we will know, and I said this at a conference a number of years ago, on the timing of the rapture. At some point, we'll know when the rapture, who was right on the timing of the rapture, right? Okay? And depending on and those who hold an incorrect position will have to eat a little humble pie. Now, if it's a preacher of rapture and we're all in heaven, easy thing to do. To forgive other people, it won't even make any difference. But if it turns out to be one of the other scenarios, then there are some other things that we need to discuss and talk about as a body of believers and as we go forward. And I have said that, and even before that event happens, I believe there are going to be clear fulfillments of prophecy where you can say this is that. I don't think we should make those statements cavalierly. We need to be very careful about making them. So we'll know more in a week what this thing on September 23rd and Revelation 12 means. Maybe. We'll see, because I suspect that if nothing happens other than alignment of some bodies in the heavens, which has a lot of people, good people on both sides, believers on both sides of this. I'm afraid that the controversy will continue, and the haranguing of people who may not hold to the view that you have is going to continue. I, on the other hand, if I'm still here and I don't die this week, which is, I think, for all of us is a possibility, I would ask for a show of hands. How many of you know the date of your exit from this planet? You don't. Not a single one of us knows. It might be by the rapture. It might be by death. And so you are always supposed to live your life as if with your next breath, you could be standing in front of the Lord. That exists regardless of what view you hold on the timing of the rapture. You should always be ready to meet the Lord. So let's, enough about that. And by the way, critical emails, go to Pastor Steve at fechapel.com. And he has a Facebook page too. You can get on there and get on him. It is it's an interesting time. There are, and I don't have any slides on this. This is one of those ones where yesterday I was thinking, I might be done in 30 minutes. And I haven't even moved to like my fourth slide yet, and I'm already running up against 15, so probably not going to be 30 minutes. And as I sat down to collect my thoughts, a lot of things came together, but with one more thing with regard to this September 23rd slide, there are a lot of articles out there right now in the secular press. I saw articles on Fox News, I think the Telegraph, Daily Mail, different newspapers about Christian numerologists predict the end of the world on September 23rd. Now, I've seen all the videos, I've read the articles, I've talked to people for hours that are some of the big names that are promoting this or believe in this. And I can say without reservation that not a single one of them predicts the end of the world on September 23rd. The problem is the way it gets discussed about. The secular press sees it. They put up articles that aren't accurate. Believe me, do I think the press is reporting things accurately? Not very often anymore. It's always got a spin, and they're going to use it, though, the spin on this, to attack Christians. And it's already starting. And there were people, now, not some of the major proponents, but there were people that came out and said the rapture will happen on around September 23rd. They've said that. And if it does, and look, if it does, everybody in here is 100% on board with saying that's fantastic. But if it doesn't, it hurts everybody that talks about this, whether it's me or Amir or Pastor JD or Charlie Garrett or any number of people. Barry Stagner, Tom Hughes, people I mentioned, Jack Hibbs, people I mentioned last week that spend time talking about this issue. It hurts all of us. There's been a lot of predictions in the past that have gone wrong. So we'll see what happens. And so that's why I titled this week, The Days Before, the Day After. Because we're going to be in the days before, the day after, until the Lord actually returns. So the sooner the better. I'm on board with that. So listen, there are all kinds of things going on in the world. There's a convergence of events. For example, you don't need to put too much of the sound up on this. There's enough going on that things of what I would consider to be epic or biblical proportions are virtually ignored in the press. For example, the West on fire, Montana. Now, praise the Lord, it appears that there's snow and rain coming to Montana that might put the fires out. But it's really been, in terms of the state of Montana, from what I can understand, in Idaho, Oregon, Washington, it's been sort of unprecedented. I mean, the pictures are just absolutely stunning as to what's happened. But because of other things that are going on, it doesn't get that much press. Another thing that's been happening is in South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, there have been many, many more people die from flooding than died in Hurricane Harvey down in Houston. And there are, by some estimates, over 1,200 dead and 41 million people, about 10 times the number affected by Harvey, affected in South Asia, and it's hardly received that much press. Mumbai, and it's the monsoon season, and you would expect it, but this flooding is unprecedented. At the time that it's happening in Bangladesh, which is really one of the poorest countries on earth, there is a ethnic religious cleansing going on in Myanmar next door. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people are fleeing Myanmar because the Buddhists in charge of the government in Myanmar, and I could be wrong on this, but as best as I can determine, are slaughtering the Muslims. And so the Muslims are fleeing, and there's satellite pictures that you can find out there today. And again, I didn't have time to pull all this stuff together, where you can go look at pictures of whole villages that have been burned in Myanmar. And the people are leaving Myanmar to go to Bangladesh, which is like, we can't take them. So Myanmar, or Bangladesh, is making a special request to the UN. How do we take care of these people? And we have our own problems with Harvey here in the United States. I saw a picture of a drag strip and racetrack down in Houston that's filled with cars. They've 30,000 cars there so far, and it could be as many as several 100,000 by the time they're done with it. Pretty much destroyed by Hurricane Harvey. So be careful if you buy a car. You need to check that out, by the way. That's just a little consumer tip. And while we're talking about that, what's going on? Well, this picture up here, at the big picture at the top, well, first of all, the little picture at the bottom is the Eastern Pacific Ocean, where there are two tropical storms churning in the Pacific going towards Mexico, which had an 8.1 earthquake last week. We have floods in South Asia. We have fires in northeast Montana. There have been floods in Europe. There have been floods in, I think, in Great Britain. It's everywhere you look, there's something going on. And now we have Jose, which is sort of sitting out there in the Atlantic, churning. And now the discussion is it going to hit the east coast of the United States around New York? Nobody knows exactly, and it's very unpredictable where these storms go. They don't know where these storms are going to go. I mean, fortunately, Irma made a little bit of a turn, and the damage was a lot less in South Florida around Naples and Tampa and Fort Myers and that sort of thing, although the Florida Keys, I understand, is pretty much destroyed and very similar to what happened in St. Martin. But just a change in that path of 20 miles would have caused, hundreds of billions of dollars more damage in Florida. Fortunately, and people, and now everybody, unfortunately, it didn't do that. And so now the next time one comes in, people say, well, nothing happened the last time. I'm riding this one out, and there's always that risk. And then there's two storms out there, Lee and Maria, that are forming and churning, and some belief that the Maria will turn into a hurricane and could hit Puerto Rico, which was spared a lot. But we don't know exactly where these, but I'm just saying is everywhere you look, these things are happening. And I will note this about Jose. it could hit New York. I will note for the record that the annual big confab, or whatever they call it, meeting of the UN starts tomorrow in New York City, when all the leaders of the world come in and they give their speeches, and they leave the room when Benjamin Netanyahu gets up to speak, and he'll be up. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, these things happen. I could take you to old presentations that I did with one of the hurricanes back in 2004 or 5, which was like Jose. It was heading off into the Atlantic. I don't remember which one it was. There were 4 hurricanes hit Florida that year, one of which was Charlie. It was one of the later ones, and it was heading off into the Atlantic. And George Bush went to the UN, and he gave a speech about Israel needs to give up land and give it over to the Palestinians and enter into a peace agreement with the Palestinians. During the hour, and I've researched this meticulously, during the hour that Bush was giving that speech, that hurricane turned and came back and hit Florida. I think it was a Category 3 when it hit. Now, my friend Bill Koenig has a book, Eye to Eye, which there's an update out if you want to get that at watch.org, where he tracks all these things. And I'm just telling you, it happens enough that I can't dismiss this out of hand. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on this week. So now my 30 minutes is up, and we'll see you next week, maybe. And Ben Shapiro. Now, he went to University of California at Berkeley. Berkeley spent $600,000 on security for his speech. They erected a perimeter of a half mile around the event that he was. They wouldn't let him sell all the tickets in the hall. And Berkeley did, fortunately, really, for the students at Cal Berkeley, supposedly one of our most prestigious institutions of higher learning, announced beforehand that they would provide counseling for students who were triggered by the appearance of Ben Shapiro. And listen, Ben Shapiro is an Orthodox Jewish guy, conservative. He's not really that physically intimidating. And he even jokes about it. I've been working out, but I don't think, anybody really needs to be afraid of me. But, they had arrests and riots and all that sort of thing. In fact, you can find the whole speech online. And here is just a little clip where somebody asked him about abortion.
Right? The problem is anytime you draw any line other than the inception of the child, you end up drawing a false line that can also be applied to people who are adults. So either human life has intrinsic value or it doesn't. I think we both agree that adult human life has intrinsic value. Can we start from that premise?
I believe that sentience is what gives something moral value, not necessarily being a human alone.
Okay, so when you're asleep, can I stab you?
I'm still considered sentient when I'm asleep.
Okay, if you are in a coma from which you may awake, can I stab you?
Well then, no, I guess not.
I'm glad you answered that because I have no interest in actually murdering you.
But that's still potential sentience, and it's still a potential.
I agree, it is potential sentience. You know what else is potential sentience? Being a fetus.
Yeah.
Okay, did you get that? He says, I'm sentient. A fetus is not sentient. It's not aware. It doesn't have feelings and thoughts and that type of thing. So he says, well, if you're asleep, can I do that? Or when you're in a coma? And he goes, no, because I'm potentially sentient. And Ben makes the great point. Well, you know what else is potentially sentient? A fetus. And the guy was destroyed in 2 sentences. So Ben he shows you how to really pick apart somebody's arguments and show them for the lack of thought that goes into them. I don't know if you're aware of this story, but Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the Democratic National Committee and a bunch of Democratic congressmen had a group of Pakistani immigrants who were running their IT, their computers. Some of those computers have sort of disappeared. The Daily Caller's done a lot of investigative work on it. And it does appear that there was a crime or potentially crimes that were committed. It doesn't get that much in the press, right? It's not talked about. Now, the interesting thing is, compared to the Russian probe, there have actually been people arrested or cut deals with prosecutors about giving testimony. Like, in fact, this guy whose picture, he was brought back, he was extradited from Pakistan, where he had fled to, or he was stopped on his way to Pakistan. I think that's the more accurate statement. And so there's more substance there, but what does the Washington Post do today? That front page, intrigue far exceeds evidence and IT probe. This is, if I was presenting a case, this would rise to at least Exhibit A or B in proof that the press has an agenda. And they're damaging themselves by pushing this. They're so wrapped up in it, they're so emotionally tied up in it that they can't reason anymore. Here's another example. Jeff Sessions issued regulations with regard to grant money. Okay, you understand the concept of a grant. You apply for a grant, and if you meet certain qualifications, you get the money. So the Department of Justice and Jeff Sessions and the executive branch of our government is charged with doling out federal money. So they put in place regulations that said, unless you comply with immigration laws, you don't get the grant money. So a bunch of cities have sued and to say, well, you can't do that because we want to be a sanctuary city because it makes us feel good about ourselves. So we don't have to comply with your regulations. And judge after judge after judge is buying this nonsense. And this judge in Chicago is a Reagan appointee. So you would think that he would understand the concept of the rule of law, but they ignore it. Listen to what he says. The court finds that Chicago has established that it would suffer irreparable harm if a preliminary injunction is not entered, there being no reason to think that the legal issues present in this case are restricted to Chicago. So what the judge was, he issued a nationwide injunction, which is extremely rare, but when you're opposing the Trump administration, it happens all the time. It's happened on the immigration, the travel ban, and that sort of, which is clearly within the president's prerogative. And he says this, recipients of the grant must comply with the federal law mandating information sharing with federal immigration officials. This is what they're required to do. It also permits Department of Homeland Security access to detention facilities to interrogate immigrants and notify DHS 48 hours prior to release of individuals suspected of immigration violations. And so what do you have? What's going on? You have unelected judges usurping the authority of elected officials. Now look, there were a lot of things that Obama did that I didn't like. But as long as they were within his statutory or constitutional authority, I didn't think there was anything that we could do about him except, vote him out, which didn't happen in 2012, or give him a good hearty farewell, see you later, don't come back when he's done with his term, and put somebody in place to undo the damage. For example, one of the things he did, which he clearly had no authority to do, in which he admitted he didn't have authority to do, was the DACA thing. He didn't have authority to do that, but he did it anyway. But do you think a judge back in those days would have put in a nationwide ban on him doing the DACA thing? No. And so now President Trump comes in and he wants to do this and say, Congress, essentially, do something. Okay? What do those guys do down there anyway? I want that job. I would have a 8-hour a week prophecy update because I wouldn't have to do anything. I'm serious. I don't know what they do. I have a congressman, used to be John Casey. I know what he does. I don't know what my congressman stands for, to be honest with you. I don't. And I know what. Well, I do. I know what he's. I know ultimately what he stands for is getting reelected. I know that is goal one of his agenda, or his platform, whatever. I don't. But other than that, I really don't know that much. He's my congressman now ever since Kasich resigned. But what they're doing is they're usurping authority of elected officials that they don't have to do, whether they agree with. And so what do? They're turning in, and one of the things the judge talked about here was, well, Trump's made what we consider to be racist comments in the past, therefore we can do anything we want to him. Look, in my life, I've done a lot of temporary restraining orders and injunction type work. I wish I could go back in cases that I lost and have the standards of proof that they have now. That would be much easier. I wouldn't have to work so hard trying to get affidavits and that type of thing. I can't. Listen, this happens in Israel. This is the leader of the Labor Party, the left party in Israel, saying, I'm going to stop Member of Parliament and Minister Naftali Bennett and Shakid from what he calls a counter-revolution against the courts. And what are they doing? They're putting in place legislation to shut down the lawmaking that goes on in Israel by unelected judges. Why? Because the same thing that's happening in Israel is happening here. And I would suggest that if I dug into it, you'll find it's happening in Canada, it's happening in Australia, it's happening in other parts of the free world. The free world may or may not include Germany, but I'll maybe talk about that in a moment. But so so they're calling them counter-revolutionists. They're just trying to have people act according to the Constitution and the law and not make it up with unelected judges that don't base things on the fact. This is an interesting article in Der Spiegel. I can't remember the title of it, but if you go to Gatestone Institute, a recent article called The Rise of Islam in Germany, you'll find this. And the man writes this article, and so I went to Der Spiegel, and so I'm trusting Google Translate to accurately translate it, but I got the gist of the article, and Miadia is his name, who wrote the article at Gatestone, makes some good points. And essentially what this guy says is, what's wrong with our institutions? And he's, I was raised Catholic, and I see things going on in the Catholic Church, the rise of this Marian apparition cult. And he says this, I am writing this from the distance of the faith which has fallen from the faith. I left the church 10 years ago, in this case from the Protestant church. As a youth, the political commitment had led me to this community. We collected bread for the world, wrote letters for Amnesty International, and demonstrated in various cities. When my political opinion changed, the contract with the church changed. And what he's saying is, what does the church stand for? It doesn't stand for anything anymore. The institutions are losing it. And so here's a guy who may or may not be a Christian. He's left the Protestant church in Germany because he says it doesn't stand for anything anymore. It has no connection to the faith. And this is happening throughout the world. I'll be speaking at a conference in Vancouver the first weekend in October. I don't know if it's going to be live stream or not. On Friday night and Saturday, I think it's October 6th and 7th. And with a couple other people, Jacob Prash and another person, can't remember the name right now, Al. And I think one of my talks is going to be on, I was looking through some things that Rob Bell has written recently, because I don't have a physical coming up and the raising of my blood pressure was going to result in any increased medication on my part. But he has a book out about Scripture, and I'm telling you, there are people in the evangelical church, I may call the presentation Ringing My Bell, Bells Ringing My Bell again, or something like that. And there's so many people in the evangelical church that need to repent of the fact that they ever had anything to do with this guy. And why do they get a pass on this? It was so obvious how far off this guy was over a dozen years ago. And people were, oh, he's such great, he's so innovative, he's so hip, he's an evangelical rock star. You remember, Pastor Steve, you saw those articles. And nobody holds the people who pushed him on everybody else accountable. And so I may talk about that. So there's a lot, so we have that going on in the church. Then we have this terrorist attack.
I said earlier today
yesterday
that
in
the national
Britain.
threat level was being kept under review. The Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, that's the independent organisation which is responsible for setting the threat level on the basis of available intelligence, has now decided to raise the national threat level from severe to critical. This means that their assessment is that a further attack may be imminent. Following JTAC's decision, the police have asked for authorisation from the Secretary of State for Defence to enact part of the first phase of Operation Tempora. This is a well-established plan to provide military support to the police. And for this period, military personnel will replace police officers on guard duties at certain protected sites which are not accessible to the public. The public will see more armed police on the transport network and on our streets, providing extra protection. And this is a proportionate and sensible step which will provide extra reassurance and protection while the investigation progresses.
Well, so there was a young man, they had this bucket bomb. It fortunately didn't kill anybody, but they had burns on their face and other places. They said they were very lucky that if he'd done it just a little differently, people could have been killed. And so President Trump, he tweets out, another attack in London by a loser terrorist. He kind of goes right to the issue. These are sick and demented people who were in the sites of Scotland Yard, must be proactive. Now, Theresa May and other people, how dare he criticize the British government for knowing about this guy? And May said, it's not very helpful that he says that. And guess what? Today, it came out in the press yesterday that this guy who was arrested for doing this bombing, and another person's been arrested, he had been arrested 2 weeks ago and let go. So it does appear that President Trump was correct and that he was in the sites of Scotland Yard. So, okay, now I'm going to turn to the area of what I want to talk about for the rest of our time here. That is completely not very well organized. But I think you'll get the point. There are a lot of things in the world right now that are distracting us from what I consider to be the significant prophetic events that are happening. We have the storms, we have arguments in the church about this and that, but there are things happening in the world that I think are very significant prophetically, and I had some messaging back and forth with Brian Schrager this morning, and he said, exactly what I'm saying right now. People are missing it, and I'm not so sure that the situation on the Temple Mount that happened that was like a month ago, right? And maybe 6 weeks ago at most. And it seems like now when we talk about it, like these things happened a year ago because everything is happening so quickly. But it might be a distraction. There's a lot of other things going on. And so now we have Putin. He has this massive, I think regularly scheduled every 4 years or so, exercise of his military on the borders of several 3 or 4 NATO countries plus Ukraine. And a lot of people are wondering, is this another distraction? Is there something else that he's planning? And part of it is, Putin has domestic issues at home. Their economy's in tatters. He's trying to pump up the patriotism so people will continue to support him. He doesn't need the money. I was reading some reports this week. He may be the wealthiest person on the planet. He controls a lot of money. But Russia is very active in doing things to prop itself up and to make itself more significant in the world. And I think that has prophetic implications. One of which is, of course, this military exercise, but another, this article is in Foreign Policy this week, inside Putin's Libyan power play. Now, we know from the alignment that's given to us in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39 that there are countries that are going to align against Israel in the last days. It appears to be that in modern terms, those countries are Russia, Turkey, maybe over into Eastern Europe, including Germany or parts of it, Persia, Iran, and Libya. And Kush, which is Sudan, which is another Muslim area. And now this week we see that Putin is making efforts to bring Libya within the Russian orbit. I think that's prophetically significant, but it's not really discussed or looked at that often. Another significant thing that happened this week, of course, Netanyahu is coming. He'll be giving a speech in the next day or two in New York City at the UN. As I'm sure Rouhani from Iran will be there. And I think these speeches need to be looked at and watched. The UN has a great multimedia website and access to all these. I'll try to pull off some clips and play them next Sunday. But it's believed that one of the things he's going to talk about is Iran. And this was an interview that Netanyahu gave on CNN earlier in the week while he was in Argentina. And I'll play the interview in just a moment. I think he went to Argentina because my recollection is that the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires was blown up years ago, and I believe it was done by Iranian people. And I think Netanyahu chose this week because of the growing tension with Iran on the border of Israel, on the northern borders of Israel, to go and make a statement, do some things in a place where Iran has done its mischief years ago. So here's Netanyahu, this is just a minute or so, interview on CNN.
In a preview of what's likely to be his upcoming UN speech next week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu railed against the Iran nuclear deal in an exclusive interview with CNN and warned it's time the world toughened up on Iran if it wants to avoid a war.
Everybody's on their target list sooner or later, but we are first on their target list. And they say openly, we are going to destroy the state of Israel.
From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks.
Netanyahu was the most vocal critic of the Iran deal. He toned it down after the deal was finalized, But with President Donald Trump making overtones against the accord, Netanyahu sees a new window of opportunity.
This agreement should be changed. It should be changed so that the removal of restrictions on Iran's nuclear program should be not a matter of the change of the calendar, but a change in Iran's aggressive behavior.
Israel sees Iran as the greatest threat in the region, with its growing influence in Syria and the increasing strength of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Netanyahu didn't rule out military action only days after the Syrian military said it was Israeli aircraft that struck a military facility in Syria.
Aside from trying to build atomic bombs, they're trying to place the Iranian army in Syria. They want to colonize Syria the way they colonized Lebanon.
Netanyahu also praised Trump's efforts to reach an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, but, like Trump, refused to commit to a two-state solution, the international consensus on the future of the region.
Depends what the other state is. Is it Costa Rica or is it North Korea? Is it Switzerland or is it Hamastan or another Iran? So I don't think this conflict is about a Palestinian state. I think it's about the rejection of the Jewish state.
Netanyahu suggested Israel would have to keep occupying at least part of the West Bank in any agreement, a condition the Palestinians unequivocally reject. In the background of this trip to Latin America is the fact that Netanyahu and his wife are under separate criminal investigations. The Attorney General has already said he intends to indict Sarah Netanyahu for fraud and breach of trust, pending a hearing. The question of an indictment still hangs over Prime Minister Netanyahu. Police have said they're investigating him for bribery and breach of trust. It'll be up to police and the Attorney General on whether to file charges. Oren Lieberman, CNN, Jerusalem.
Again, what's going on with the Netanyahus is identical to what's going on with President Trump. It's a political thing. It's a witch hunt. Best I can determine, the allegations of Sarah Netanyahu, and she's passed a lie detector test, is my understanding, is she ordered some takeout food or something like that and had it delivered to the prime minister's residence and charged it to, I don't know. It, so it's a witch hunt. And he went to Putin and he wanted a 60-kilometer buffer zone. That's roughly 37, 38 miles, where there would be no Iranian troops allowed. Putin rejected that. Now, 38 miles, to give you some idea, if you go to the Golan Heights, which is, there's a no man's land between Israel and Syria, and you go to the Golan Heights and you go 38 miles, you've probably gone through downtown Damascus. That's about the distance to downtown center of Damascus from the Golan. So you don't want Iranians in that area. I think it's a reasonable request, but they refused because they're playing this game, and it's very critical what's happening. So I'm going to skip over. So I mentioned this last week. The IDF put in place a large-scale exercise on the northern front with Lebanon, up around where Hezbollah is, the largest exercise they've had in years. Russia begins its war games. I mentioned that already. ISIS is being defeated, but the question is, what's replacing ISIS? Iran. And is the Iranian government better than ISIS? In many respects, no. The other thing you need to remember, and I don't want people to interpret what I'm saying as I believe that Iranians or Muslims are beyond the redemptive power of the gospel. Okay, we should share the gospel with them. But, governments also have a responsibility to protect their people. And I do see some evidence of a revival, people coming to the Lord in Iran and other Muslim Arab countries. And I think that happens. I mean, there's a great, Arnold Fruchtenbaum has a great article about the Arab states and prophecy. A lot of those people will come to the Lord. And I think the revival that we see, because some great people are going and sharing the gospel with Muslims in the Middle East right now at great risk to their lives, will bear some fruit. And I think it has a prophetic aspect to it as well, because the Jews flee into the wilderness, and I think they're protected there. Now we can argue about who protects them. It's supernatural or people that understand their prophetic role. Probably both. That's my personal opinion. But but I think the leaders of Iran see this happening, and they see the demographic shift that's happening. Russia sees the demographic shift that's happening and its existence being questioned. Merkel in Germany sees a demographic shift happening. And so what you have is yet another event that's causing these end time events to converge. That these players see that there's not a lot of time for them to do what they want to do because of the way things are shifting underneath their own feet. And that's why I think you're seeing Iran being more active. You're seeing Russia being more active. You're seeing these things happening. I think Saudi Arabia is shifting its geopolitical decisions because of what's happening. So that's all playing into this. And then here's yet another distraction, is North Korea. Now, he may, I wouldn't want to be the president because you're dealing with a guy who's believes himself to be a god and who's been taught that all of his life, and you just don't know what he's going to do. And do you risk letting him fly a nuke into Los Angeles and take out 1 million people on the hope that he's not very good at firing the missile, so it hits, San Diego instead? You don't want to be the president when that sort of thing happens. And so Trump has to do something, and you've got this crazy guy doing these things. And North Korea is a terrible place. Even people in the foreign policy and some of the, I would call them more conventional State Department people, say, what are you going to do? I mean, doing anything is going to cause a catastrophe. It's interesting. I was doing some research this week. This is a picture of a road in North Korea along the coast. And you see those fence posts? It is my understanding there's about 1,500 miles of coastline in North Korea, and it's got an electric fence around it, so people can't leave by water. Now, I hesitate whether I should play this because she didn't win, but on Rachel Maddow, Hillary Clinton was asked about the North Korea situation, and I really wrestled with whether I should inflict this kind of willful pain on people, but this one's just too good to pass up. So here's Hillary Clinton on Rachel Maddow on her What Happened tour, where she's blaming everybody for her loss. So here's a question about North Korea.
We know we can't get anything done in this very threatening situation if we don't work with our allies, South Korea and Japan, and also bring China in. The president has basically insulted and attacked South Korea. South Korea is literally, within miles of the border with North Korea. They would be so at risk if something were done by Kim Jong-un.
Okay, so geography lesson. According to Hillary Clinton, this part of the line is within miles of this part of the line. And I suppose it's accurate. And, if Trump had made the same statement, it would be front page news everywhere for weeks. But, and I think she probably misspoke. I think she might have meant Seoul is within view. And there's a demilitarized zone, but trust me, the border goes through the demilitarized zone. So the South Korea, from here, you go to the room at the 38th parallel in the DMZ, in like, you stand here in South Korea and you stand here in North Korea. It's that close, all through the demilitarized zone. So she, I don't know, she didn't do too well. So, and you see these reports, the security chief saying in Israel that the West Bank situation is very fragile. There's a conflict between Hamas and Hezbollah. Here's a Hamas rally, and you see the poster that the person's carrying. It's a picture of, maybe this is a little bit bigger, of Ivanka Trump with her Jewish husband Jared Kushner on a chain. And this is, it looks like it's not by the way, it's not an Antifa rally. It's a rally in the West Bank, in the Palestinian part of Israel. And this goes back a couple months. This is a pro-Palestinian conference in Tehran. Had people from 70 countries. And the Ayatollah Khomeini said that Islam requires us to support the Palestinian cause. And again, this is what Iran's always playing chess. And we're playing checkers a lot of times, and it's hard to keep up with what they're doing. That resulted in Prime Minister Netanyahu noted this countdown clock that was put up in Tehran around this time left before the destruction of Israel. And here's what he had to say.
You know, maybe the Iranians should study Jewish history. Because last week in Tehran, they put up a digital clock counting down to Israel's destruction. Well, we were here in this land for thousands of years before the Ayatollahs took the people of Iran hostage, and we'll be here long after. Their theocratic tyranny is just a footnote of history.
So that was a speech he gave a few months ago in response to this doomsday clock. In Syria right now, on this area of along the Euphrates River, in the area in the red circle there, the U.S.-backed rebels, Russia and Syria and Iran were said, don't go across the Euphrates River or we'll do something about it. So what did they do this week? Hezbollah and Syria put up pontoon bridges and went across the Euphrates River just in the last couple of days. I don't know what we're going to do about it. This was reported on Debka today. It just shows, I think, the important situation of what's going on on the northern borders of Israel. And I don't think Israel will let it go. If you remember back, September 6, 2007, just 10 years and 9 days ago, or 10 years and 11 days ago, Israel flew to a place called Al-Kabar. 2 jets flew up the Mediterranean, across southern Turkey, dropped external fuel tanks, then came down to the south to this nuclear reactor that was being built near you see the Euphrates River there above, because they need a lot of water for a nuclear reactor, being built in Syria. And it was an identical copy of a nuclear reactor from, guess what country? North Korea. And they took it out. And it was very controversial. But look, Israel will take care of this because they understand the threats. And they see this connection between North Korea and Syria and North Korea and Iran. And they recognize the threat that Iran is to the world geopolitical structure. So they took out this reactor, and I think they'll do something like it again. And this headline from a couple years ago, how Israel prevented the Islamic State from going nuclear, because that area was in the area of the Islamic State until recently. So now they're going across. The president had a phone call. This is a common thing around Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. It's been common for the president to have a call with Jewish rabbis and other leaders. A lot of conservative and reformed rabbis refused to participate in the call with Donald Trump because he's anti-Semitic, I guess, which is, and Jared Kushner, you see this is the phone call taking place. And even the Jerusalem Post, professing love for Israel, U.S. president condemned those promoting anti-Semitism. You can even see in the Jerusalem Post the cynicism in the way the headline is written. Professing love. His grandkids are Jewish. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is Jewish. Now, whether you agree with that, it's stunning to me. And the president said, look, he did come out and say we're going to try to achieve peace with the Palestinians. Well, I'm going to play for the last thing just a little bit. Caroline Glick has a great article in the Jerusalem Post last Tuesday about our State Department, what's going on. There's a lot of controversy there about whether the State Department really has Israel's best interests at heart. She notes in her article that, there's this push to normalize things with Iran. There used to be thousands of Jews that lived in Iran. Now there are virtually zero. Why? Because Iran doesn't want Jews around. And if they get a nuclear bomb, they have power to make sure that they don't want Jews around. So you ought to read about that. In fact, she says this: between 1948 and 1951, 130,000 Iraqi Jews, 3/4 of the community, were forced to flee the country. Those who remained faced massive persecution, imprisonment, torture, execution, and expulsion in the succeeding decades. When the U.S. forces overthrew the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein in 2000, only a dozen or so remained in Iraq. Today, there are none left. So she goes on to note that this is a problem, but the State Department knows all this, but it doesn't seem to make any difference to them. And there's an article I pulled out from Foreign Policy a few months ago. There's a lady who's been put in charge of counterterrorism. She was hired by McMaster as a carryover from the last administration, who is very much a supporter of Iran. In fact, there's an article in Foreign Policy written, "For Muslims at the Pentagon, a tough election year." And it talks about this person. Her name is Iram Ali. She oversees hundreds of White House political appointments to the Pentagon. Her mandate, as tasked by the Obama administration, is to recruit and attract people of all ethnic, educational, and religious backgrounds. A policy the White House believes will foster a better informed and more effective class of security leaders. And it goes on to talk about how strong her faith is. And she's been hired by McMaster to serve essentially, I believe, the same post in the current security structure, at least maybe over at the National Security Council. You might look up that article on Foreign Policy. Here's a brief discussion. I'll just play a couple minutes of it. You can find it on her website, MelaniePhillips.com. Melanie Phillips talking to Avi about the Iranian situation.
Yes, I mean, as you said, we're all very worried about North Korea, very understandably so, and I wouldn't want to minimize the threat from that for a moment. But the bigger threat, in my view, is Iran. And it's a source of enormous concern to me that so many people in the West not only relegate it down their agenda of concerns, but in fact deny that it is a concern at all. Whereas, in my view, it is one of the major players, if not the major player, against the West. In a complicated scenario, obviously, we know that Sunni Saudi Arabia is the fount of the kind of ideological Islamist war against the West, but Iran, no less than Saudi Arabia, is involved in trying to destroy the West and indeed is also threatening genocide against Israel, and for analogous fanatical religious reasons. So this is usually overlooked or denied. Now, what I read recently was something that was all too horribly plausible. It was a piece of work by a scholar that I very much respect, Dr. Mordechai Kedar, who is a great expert on Islam and on the Middle East. And he made an observation which chimes very much with concerns that are already very much in Europe about the tremendous influx of so-called refugees, most of whom are actually migrants, flooding in from Syria, but also from other countries of the developing world, and which were famously given a kind of entree to Europe by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who basically threw open the doors of Germany and said, we can do this in German, meaning we can absorb all these people. About 1 million flooded in. And this caused enormous concern in and outside Germany. In Germany, because these mainly Muslim, mainly male migrants brought with them a host of social problems, not the least of which was fairly widespread violence against women, most of whom were indigenous German women, but also women among their own community. But the wider concern in Europe was that people could see that since the rules of Europe allow for, in fact, mandate open access for people across the borders of countries of Europe, you only had to come into Germany for these people to be able to spread out across Europe. Right. And consequently, with untold millions more wanting to come in, and with Turkey threatening to flood Europe, literally threatening to flood Europe with such migrants, President Erdogan of Turkey, who is an Islamist, has said even a whole load of Muslim individuals would be in Europe anyway. So this is already a problem in Europe. Into this maelstrom, Dr. Kedar has posited a very frightening and all too plausible scenario, which is that Iran will, and already has perceived, just as Erdogan has said the way to Islamize Europe is to flood it with migrants, Iran has perceived that demography is a tremendous weapon in its own arsenal, and that it can leverage the crisis and the terrible war in Syria to that end. And what Dr. Kedar points out is that there has already been a fair measure of ethnic cleansing of Sunni Muslims from Syria, right, affected by Iran in particular, and that now, with the Sunnis being perceived by the Alawites, who are the ruling caste, the ruling clan in Syria, with the Sunnis perceived to be their mortal enemies, they will never allow the Sunnis back into Syria. So Sunni Syrian refugees, insofar as they think they're going to go back to Syria, says Dr. Kedar, they've got another thing coming. They're not going to be allowed back, and meanwhile, Iran is going to populate Syria even more with Shiites. And two things will therefore be accomplished. One is that Syria will become an Iranian satrapy, an Iranian province, even more than it is at the moment. And consequently, Iran will be helped to achieve its ambition of regional hegemony, which should frighten everybody. And secondly, Iran will have helped lever out of Syria a whole bunch of refugees who are going to, if they can't get back into Syria, they're going to want to come into Europe. So you could have a kind of a sort of de facto alliance between Germany, Turkey and Iran, with rather different agendas, which will end in the destruction of Europe as we know it.
And that's a very interesting observation by Melanie Phillips. You can go to her website, melaniephillips.com, click on videos, and you can see the full 45 minutes that she talked to Avi Abiglo about that. And Avi also had a great interview with Caroline Glick this week. You can find that on Caroline Glick's Facebook page. This is the article that Melanie was referencing by Dr. Mordechai Kedar. Iran operating from Syria will destroy Europe and North America. There's a long-term plan at work here aimed at destroying the West, and it can work. And he goes into great detail about how the Sunnis have been driven out of Syria, and they're not coming back. there's 3.5 million in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. They're not coming home. Okay? All the ones that have already left and another 3.5, 4 million or more are going to leave. They're going to be forced out or they're going to be killed. And Iran is there. This is in the Quran. This is how you conquer another country by immigration. It's laid out right there. And it's concerning that there's a lot of people in our State Department that don't get it. It's concerning that Germany goes along with it, and they don't get it either. So I would add to the phrase that I've made a couple times in the past that I got from Dennis Prager: Germany is almost always wrong when it comes to geopolitics. I would say that phrase should now be Germany is almost always wrong when it comes to geopolitics, and so is the U.S. State Department. And so something needs to be done. They don't call it foggy bottom, the State Department, for nothing, because and so I would say that this article by Dr. Kadir is something that you should look up and read. I'll talk a little bit more about it when I have some additional time, but this is a plan. And listen, Assad is on board with it. There have been a couple of rebellions against the Assad regime before, and it came from the Sunni areas of Syria. So they put it down, and now they're putting down the next one. And this one, they're going to solve the problem by getting rid of the Sunnis. And you see it doing, and they're shipping them to Europe, which is destabilizing Europe. And Germany seems to be kind of rising to the dominant force in Europe now that Great Britain has left. And this may have prophetic implications as to alignment. But this alignment, I think, between Germany, Turkey, Iran, I think is very prophetically significant, what Melanie Phillips talked about there. And so this is, I think, where the big focus should be, is what's Iran doing right now. And then we'll look at what the UN, next week we'll look at what the UN's doing. So exciting times to be alive. And if I offended anybody, what I said earlier, I apologize. That's not my intent. I think this is a very stressful time to be alive. I think it's going to get more stressful. I think we're past the point where it's going to go back to what it was like. We've sort of idolized what it was like back in the 50s or the 60s for a time. And even though that wasn't so great for a lot of people, because there was a horrible racial divide in our country at that time that was not good. It was just not. It couldn't be justified under any interpretation of Scripture. But the church really needs to get its act together, and maybe focusing on the gospel and evangelism is a way that the church can actually get back to the proper focus. We need to continue to watch all of this, and we will continue to do that here. But let's play nice, I guess is the way to see it. And so we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. Let's pray. Father, again, we're so grateful for the grace that you've shown us through the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ, and what he did for us on the cross at Calvary. And Lord, we pray that you will help us to remember that good news needs to be shared with everyone. And we pray that you will give us wisdom and patience and grace as we operate in very difficult times, that will keep on message, and that will still continue to be aware of what's going on and warning others, as we should, about the times that are coming. Just pray that you'll bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.